Zdravstvuyte, and welcome to episode 5 of my Soviet Union vlog. This time we're looking at the transition of power from Lenin to Stalin and thinking a bit about what it shows us about how power and government operated in the 1920s. So you remember that in 1917, the Bolshevik grip on power was tenuous at best. They weren't even the most popular socialist party in Russia at that time. But that through a series of events and through a process of civil war over the next 4 years, by 1921, they had secured their hold through a number of ways, I guess, through violence, through winning the civil war, using terror as well, which we're going to come back to a little bit in maybe a next episode, in fact, through legal mechanisms, banning other parties, uh, semi-legal shutting down of elections and cancelling election results, through the monopoly of the press. So they're kind of pseudo-legal. They're not really legal in the way we think of them, but they'd use the law on their side there. Through centralising power through the party, the use of democratic centralisation, the idea that power flowed from the centre out through the party and through the country, but that equally that there was a democracy within the party where if you were a local member, then you could elect someone to the regional and then the national bodies who would elect people to the central committee. So there was a kind of trickle up effect as well. But that idea of centralising power through the party is very important. And the dominance of the party over the state. So we haven't really talked about this, but the party's structure mimicked and overlapped the state structure. So in the party, as we said, you'd have regional and local bodies, but you'd have a central or Russian party congress, and they would gather together and they would elect a central committee, and from that would come kind of like a sort of 50-man body to sort of oversee things, the central committee, but too big to make day-to-day decisions. So from that would come the Politburo, who were like our kind of cabinet idea in the UK. Alongside that, the state institutions, the All Russian Congress of Soviets, is the equivalent of Party Congress. And the All Russian Congress of Soviets would elect the Central Executive Committee, the equivalent of the party's Central Committee. And they would elect, the Central Executive Committee would elect the Sovnarkom, very much the equivalent of our cabinet, which was like the official state, the ministers of the state were from that. But of course, over time, the same people tend to end up in the same roles, and the party position is much more important. And particularly once other parties are banned, people tended to value their party position more than their state position. We'll come back to why that is, or we'll see why that is through this episode. Of course, also in 1924, the establishment of the Soviet Union through the new constitution also helped centralize power within the Soviet Union. Russia was extremely dominant in that. So power in Russia equaled power in the Soviet Union. 90% of the land was Russia, 72% of the population, and almost 3/4 of the party membership. So dominate Russia, dominate the Soviet Union, even though in theory it was a federal system where each socialist Soviet republic had, I probably said that wrong around, Soviet Socialist Republic, had power and control of their area, but in practice dominated by Russia. And the impact of all of this is seen through growing membership of the Communist Party. Figures vary, but maybe up to 1 million people were members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by 1924, and the establishment of the nomenclature system, which meant that you needed to be a member of the party in order to be accepted for certain jobs within the Soviet Union from the early 20s. So if you wanted to be party chief, obviously, you would need to be a party member. That's an obvious one. The mayor, perhaps, of a local town, the manager of a factory, certainly an officer in the army. All of these positions, the head teacher of a local school even, would be positions of power and responsibility, and they would only be given to party members. So it's very important to become a member of the Communist Party for social advancement. And of course, the other thing that's happened in this time is that Lenin has become in charge of the whole country, not just in charge of the Bolshevik faction of socialists. However, he dismissed the idea of being a dictator. He called it nonsense in 1919. And although in the sort of 2-3 years after that, his power does rise. I think it's fair to say that Lenin didn't really perceive himself as being a dictator, certainly not in an absolute sense. He was leader for sure, but not a dictator in a totalitarian absolute sense. Examples of disagreement and debate within the party include Kamenev and Zinoviev disagreeing with him about the timing of the revolution, but being forgiven, the revolution 1917, but being forgiven for that and used in very important positions within the Bolshevik Party in the next 3, 4, 5 years. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was hugely debated within the party, very controversial within the Politburo, to the extent that Lenin kind of needed to almost say, well, if you reject it, I'm out, almost threatening to resign in order to get it passed. The NEP was massively controversial within the party as well. A number of the top-ranking Bolshevik communists were against that, including Trotsky, whom it comes back to bite later on. And we mentioned last time about the workers' opposition group, led by Alexandre Kollontai and Alexander Shelapnikov, I think, which led to the ban on factions being implemented in 1921. Now, so there was this debate within the party, but that was being closed down by 1921 as Lenin tried to run a tighter ship and was aware that he was steering a course that was controversial. So in 1922, Stalin was appointed general secretary in charge of the day-to-day running of the party, but also to keep an eye on party discipline and look out for opposition. And although at this time, Lenin's at the height of his political power, his position immediately weakens from here on in. His health declines in 1922. He has a series of strokes. His third stroke in 1923 left him unable to speak except in single syllables. And really, power leaks away from him. And even while he's still alive, party members are starting to position themselves for a struggle. Of course, he dies in 1924, and he writes in his testament quite negative things, really, about all the main players in the top ranks of the party. What this indicates, I think, is that Lenin, as we said, didn't see himself as being the dictator and certainly didn't anticipate the rise of a new dictator after him. He wasn't looking ahead and thinking, oh, Stalin's a bit of a danger, he'll become a dictator. Or even that Trotsky, who was seen as odds on for being quite autocratic, he wasn't thinking of them as being a problem. He was thinking, actually, they're all flawed individuals and that they all need to work together, that this idea of a collective leadership probably in Lenin's mind as he dies. So this is one way in which, perhaps in Lenin's head, more than in practice, there was a difference between the way Lenin and future leaders would see government within the Soviet Union. Of course, Stalin is able to overcome the opposition and willing and lays plans for that and ambitious enough to and part of that is to do with his position as General Secretary. In that position, he has a number of advantages. He has access to personnel files, over 26,000 personnel files on party members. He's able to read about them and look out for them, line them up, pick the ones that he likes and the ones that he doesn't like. Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka, reported to him. He had Politburo members under surveillance, so he was able to check on what their views are, what they're doing, whether they're talking, meeting, campaigning in ways that they shouldn't be doing. He gets to decide the agenda of party meetings. He was in charge of the Lenin enrollment, which is the scheme to, as Lenin died, and then definitely after he dies, to say, join the party in memory of Lenin, celebrate this great hero of the Soviet Union by becoming a member of the Communist Party. And these people joining, of course, are now joining in full knowledge that joining the Communist Party is a way which you can socially advance yourself. So it's the gateway to benefits, and Stalin is the key to that for these people. He also appointed people to positions within the party, which brought with them a lot of loyalty. Molotov, Kalinin, Voroshilov were all nominated party positions at this time. Sergei Kirov, who we'll talk about later on in the vlogs, became head of the party in Leningrad in 1926 when Stalin got rid of Zinoviev and was looking for a more loyal local party chief. So Stalin has a number of advantages at this time, but he does still need to deal with the other members, the other leaders of the Communist Party. And this happens in 3 phases. So I'm going to whip through this quickly and then we'll think about what we learn about the government of the Soviet Union at this time. So phase 1, 1924, 1925, this is dealing with Trotsky. Trotsky is seen as being the main threat by all the other leaders. Um, Significantly, he didn't turn up to the funeral of Lenin. This is seen as being really quite strange. And it leaves a gap for Stalin to be chief mourner and to immediately start positioning himself as the man to take on the mantle of Lenin. Trotsky accused Stalin of not telling when the funeral was, but historians are pretty skeptical about that now. They're not really sure why Trotsky wasn't there, but they blame him more than Stalin for that. However, importantly, Kamenev and Zinoviev agreed to work against Trotsky, initially seeing him as the threat. Trotsky was critical of the bureaucracy and the centralized power of the Communist Party, and was appealing for more democracy within the party. But he criticized Kamenev and Zinoviev in that because they were opposing him. And he failed to recognize that the party actually now relied on bureaucracy to work. And crucially, I think that benefited many of the members. They were getting jobs out of this and position and status out of this in their local community. So Trotsky is outmaneuvered in the first one really by being kind of unwise. As Stalin's power begins to grow, the second phase kicks in 1926, and this unites Kamenev and Zinoviev with Trotsky against Stalin. Now, partly because Kamenev and Zinoviev now come out against the NEP and in favour of what's called permanent revolution. Both of these ideas chimed with what Trotsky was about, and they both seem to now be thinking actually Stalin's the man we need to deal with. And in the NEP, of course, very socialist, very Marxist. Permanent revolution was the idea of seeking to spread revolution abroad and to encourage them to have communist revolutions there. So again, very kind of on message in terms of ideology. But Stalin's able to outmaneuver them because at that time the NEP was working, people were settled down, and he puts forward the idea of socialism in one country. He basically says, let's get the Soviet Union right first. I believe in the Soviet Union. We don't need the help of foreigners. We can do this ourselves. And that is quite a popular message, particularly within the party. And Stalin understands that the party is now not so ideological because of all these latecomers to it. So Kamenev and Zinoviev was kicked out of the Politburo. In 1928, they are let back in after asking for forgiveness. But Trotsky is exiled firstly internally to Siberia and then kicked out of the country in 1929. Having defeated the left then, that's Kamenev and Zinoviev and Trotsky, in 1927, 28, so the winter of 27 into 1928, Stalin decides that now is the time to get rid of the NEP. It had stopped working quite so well. Lenin had always said it was a temporary measure, so he's not really going against Lenin. He's now able to say this is what Lenin would want. Earlier, of course, when he's defending the NEP, he says this is what Lenin brought in. So both times he's able to say, oh, this is what Lenin would have wanted. Lenin wasn't after the NEP forever. It was a temporary measure. Now's the time to jump and to push on with industrialization, which is a much more kind of ideologically valid policy for the communists. Bukharin and his allies resist that, Tomsky and others. Stalin is able to undermine Bukharin in a number of ways. He talks about how Bukharin had fallen out with Lenin in the early 1920s. He's able to talk about how Bukharin had met secretly with Kamenev and Zinoviev in 1928. And of course, he's able to point crucially to the fact that the NEP is failing and to push his idea of socialism in one country, that we need to build up the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is the place that needs to get this right. And he pushes that button of nationalism, of national pride very well, very effectively. And so he defeats Bukharin as well. And by 1928, really, Stalin is now in charge. And we'll look next time a bit at terror and how Stalin consolidates and changes the way that government in the Soviet Union worked. But for now, I just want to finish by just drawing out some parallels here of how government worked from 1917 all the way through to 1928. So, firstly, there's a growing centralisation through that period. But note that even up to 1928, there is space for debate about policy. And that had taken place over Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, over the NEP, when it was introduced in 1921, and now in 1927-28. Now, Stalin's able to make those people, to remove those people and accuse them of factionalism, but nevertheless, there is some debate and there are votes at the party congresses. By the sort of mid to late 20s, the control of the party is the same as controlling the Soviet Union. And really, that had begun to be the case with the closing of the Constituent Assembly and the banning of other parties. So both Lenin and then Stalin recognized that controlling the party is key to controlling the country. The removal of opposition, Lenin had to remove opposition without outside the party, and Stalin more removing opposition from within the party. But in both cases, the removal and silencing of opposition was key to how that would work. And I guess, therefore, they're the closing down of democracy. Both of them had used terror, which we'll reflect on next time, and both of them had used very pragmatic policies. Lenin, of course, his main pragmatic policy was the NEP, or most pragmatic policy, but Stalin equally had defended the NEP, but then when the time was right, and then closed it down when it seemed to have run its course. And then finally, the growing use of bureaucracy within this system, that Stalin really had been able to outmaneuver his opponents because he understood that there was a paperwork trail to the way that the party worked, and that was the key to controlling the country. That counting votes in the party congress and obeying the rules of factionalism that had been laid down by Lenin, and by appealing to the people that were making those decisions in the party congress and the central committee, that these were the keys to hanging on to power, and that they are the way which you control the government of the Soviet Union. So next time, of course, we'll see a bit of terror and how Stalin consolidates this control, and we'll start to be able to draw out some of the differences between Stalin and Lenin. But for now, that is how Stalin gains control and some of the similarities between his rule and Lenin. I hope that was useful. See you next time.